Before Rome was a republic, it was a kingdom. And the last king of Rome, his name was Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquinius the Proud. This was a fitting name for a man who was quite rightly deemed a tyrant. Now, Tarquinius had a son named Sextus, and this son Sextus, well, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. He was a scheming, evil man who was sent on a mission by his father as a double agent to defect to a rival city-state of Gabii. Sextus ingratiated himself with the Gabini senators, wrapping his tendrils around the organs of power and finally advocating for war against Rome. Now naturally, the king of Rome allowed his son and the Gabini some victories and ensured that enough loot was conveniently lost to the Gabini that Sextus was able to distribute the wealth among the Gabini elite. Soon enough, Sextus had not only gained the full trust of the Gabini, but had near total power within their system. It was at this point that Sextus sent a messenger to his father, asking for instruction on what he should do now that his power was secure. The Roman king Tarquinius received the messenger, and the messenger asked what the king would have his son do. Tarquinius said nothing, ignoring the messenger, as if he was deep in meditation. He walked past the man and out into the garden, and he took a stick, and he walked up and down the garden path, striking off the heads of any poppy that stood above the others. The messenger had his questions ignored, and frustrated at not receiving an answer, he departed back for Gabii. And when he returned to the son Sextus, he relayed what had happened, thinking that his mission was a failure. But Sextus understood what the messenger did not, and he set about divesting himself of all of the elites of Gabii, of all those of ambition, of talent, and of prestige, whether by or by banishment. The heads of those tall poppies were scythed off, one after another, until, denuded of all people of ability, the state of Gabii went out not with a bang, but a whimper, and was absorbed into the kingdom of Rome. And that is the origin of the tall poppy. In my native New Zealand, we call it a syndrome, tall poppy syndrome. And we don't need a tyrant to administer the scything, because the public at large does a grand job of it, just as it is. Like the crab that tries to escape the bucket, but gets pulled down by the other crabs. Now, being charitable, the idea of a tall poppy syndrome is supposed to be that individuals who set themselves above others and persist in that idea that they are better will get cut down to size. But it's not just the arrogant that get cut down. In the most dysfunctional form of that norm, there's a lot of collateral damage. And you should care, because there's a misnomer that this syndrome is unique to countries born of the womb of Great Britain, but it's not. Janteloven in the Nordic countries, my veldkultur in the Netherlands, to be a shakatir, a turncoat in Chile. The Japanese have the phrase, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. And while many of these cultures share either an egalitarian mindset or indeed a sense of sticking with one's own group. In the case of countries that were colonies of Great Britain, many of those who emigrated from the British Isles were working and lower middle class people, and in the UK to this very day there is a sense of sticking with one's own class. And so when we found ourselves in these new societies with less rigid social hierarchies, there may have been a sense that this equitable situation shouldn't go away, that people shouldn't inadvertently set themselves above others. Maybe that factors into how we view others in society, but maybe there's also a sense of envy that can be suppressed unless a person's accomplishments and betterment is shoved in our face. Then again, in some instances, it could be motivated by a sense of maintaining ownership over a friendship. Those who rise in stock are likely to be a hotter commodity than they were before, and you're likely to have more competition for their friendship. And what is one of the most important things about friendship? I'm not talking garden variety mates here, but true friendship. What's one of the most important things? I reckon it's reliability. Evolutionarily speaking, one of the reasons friendship is adaptive is because it confers all of these tangible benefits to survival, emotional support, someone you can call upon when you need help with something, someone that makes you feel good. And while we're listing adaptations, friendship is far from bereft of reproductive benefits. Having solid friends is attractive to potential mates. But if that friend is unreliable, well, the logic is that you'd be better off spending time with someone else. After all, your time is zero sum. More time spent with one thing means less time for other things. So, if we're being rational, we might seek to maximize our utility. Perhaps as individuals, we're not even aware that we're doing it. It's implicit, in other words. Much like our conformity to shaping our own behaviour to avoid sticking our heads above ground, to avoid being the nail that sticks out, to avoid being the tall poppy that your friends must compete for. Where I live in New Zealand, this show of equality often takes the practice of stating, "Oh, I'm just lucky." And as a corollary, many of us feel this sense of imposter syndrome if we rise to heights that might set us above another person in some manner. When we can't stomach putting it down to luck, we put it down to our labour, meaning anybody could achieve the same thing. We like that idea. It fits with our egalitarian values. But we are taught to detest publicly recognising our own attributes. I'm dancing around the words, but they're already on our lips. Skill and talent. It runs against the unspoken social code to admit those things in ourselves. It's fine for us to admit that others have talent, just as long as they exercise enough humility in the face of that recognition. You see, we have a cult of humility in my nation, and you might too. But the question is, what underlies all of that? If the years since the 2016 United States election and the pandemic that followed have done anything positive for us, it's been to shine a light on just how tribal we are, despite all the window dressing of supposed civility. Of course, having a tribal nature isn't just about group conflict, it's also about how you identify with your group and the value that it has for you and your well-being. Our group memberships form a core part of who we are, so to lose our standing, or worse, to be excluded or ostracised, would be to lose a part of ourselves. Symbolic death. In fact, when we used to live in small tribes, ostracism presented the very real risk of death. Being ostracised meant we could no longer draw on the shared resources and support of the group to defend ourselves, to acquire food, and to be cared for if we got sick or injured. Now, even though ostracism no longer carries the same physical danger to us that it once did, it's still the wiring that we live with today. And what triggers our anxiety towards ostracism is likely to be dependent on the norms of the culture, i.e., what behaviour is considered appropriate. We violate group norms when we toot our own horn. But it's more than that, because here in New Zealand, at least, our norms require us to pretend that the horn isn't even there to be played. Let's look at a case study. Israel Adesanya, the middleweight champion of the world in mixed martial arts. Originally from Nigeria, Adesanya is an adopted Kiwi who's lived most of his life here. Adesanya represents us Kiwis, along with Nigerians, on the international stage, and he is a prestigious talent. Now in the fight game, to draw audiences to watch you, to become a star, you need to have personality. And the tried and true persona that draws the most eyeballs is the larger-than-life character for which confidence is key. Think of Muhammad Ali as the archetype. And in that vein, Adesanya has a supremely confident persona, something that has allowed him to reclaim the championship from the man who beat him 2, arguably 3 times in a row, and finished him twice. And yet, while Adesanya is a star inside the UFC, he's not always held in the highest of regards here in New Zealand. Not that everyone dislikes him. He's got a lot of fans, myself included, but never the whole nation behind him. I've lost count of the amount of people who've told me, "Hey, I love watching Izzy fight, but I don't always like the way he behaves. He's too cocky." It rubs a lot of Kiwis the wrong way. Now in February 2022, Adesanya fought New Zealand-born Māori and Australian raised Robert Whittaker. A humble, everyman kind of guy. Kind of guy you could have a beer with at a bar.
I told my opponent tweeted some nasty stuff about me last night, but it's all pretty spot on. Bit of a wake-up call, really.
But on the face of it, the allegiance of us Kiwis should have been a no-brainer. New Zealand's adopted son, the champion of the world, versus the man who would rather represent our cousins across the ditch. But so many of my friends said to me, lowering their voice, as if to utter some foul secret, you know, I kind of want Rob to win. Take this anecdote with a grain of salt. But maybe it reveals that Whittaker's humble everyman personality fits closer with our cultural norms than does Adesanya's overt confidence. Now, it may be that there are darker undertones here. Research suggests that in New Zealand, Europeans or Pākehā see Māori and Pākehā as being equally Kiwi, but other ethnicities are less Kiwi. Maybe there are those that see African sports star success as the norm, whereas the Māori lad, by contrast, well, he's the underdog. And I can tell you, we Kiwis sure do love a good underdog. But then who doesn't? However, if racial stereotypes are a factor, I would warrant it doesn't overshadow our cultural instinct to scythe off the heads of the tall poppies. Now, where adherence to our cultural norms becomes a problem is this. It makes being openly ambitious a dangerous game. An ambitious person needs to be careful who they tell about their dreams and what they choose to publicly recognise in themselves. However, as our respective countries chart their course through the turbulent winds of an uncertain 21st century, it is the very people who are talented, ambitious and success-driven that we need most. I'm not saying either of us need a nation of ultra-confident professional prize-fighters, but flexibility is critical to navigating difficult times, and we are headed for some difficult times. And in the spirit of Thomas Jefferson, who said every generation needs a revolution, perhaps it is time for us to re-examine what cultural organs of our respective countries are useful and which are merely vestigial. But this is really only half the story. If you want to see an example of what happens when you have too strong a cultural norm of standing above others, check out this video up here. If you like this video and you want to see more, you know what to do. I'm grateful that you've chosen to spend a little bit of your zero-sum time with me today. Until next time.